My name is Flyn van Ewijk. I'm the chair of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand, and I also have the pleasure of serving on the Bioenergy Australia board. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians. I recognise their cultures, histories, diversity, and their deep connection to the land, seas and waters. I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians on the land in which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be in the room today, and I would also like to acknowledge our special guests. The Honourable Jackie Jarvis, MLC, Western Australian Minister for Agriculture, Food, Forestry and Small Business, and Ms Jess Small, MLA, Member for Swan Hills. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to any other parliamentary representatives who are joining us today. I'd like to pass on apologies to Shahana McKenzie, who would ordinarily welcome you today, but Shahana, our CEO of Bioenergy Australia, is in Brazil, participating in the Clean Energy Ministerial and G20 special session as a representative of Australia. I'd also like to thank today's sponsors, the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, the US Grains Council, GrainCorp and Chevron for their support in making this fantastic event possible. And I'd also like to extend, on behalf of Bioenergy Australia, my gratitude to members and our guests for attending. A key area of focus for Bioenergy Australia is supporting the essential role of low carbon fuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, biodiesel and ethanol. As you know, these fuels are critical for decarbonising Australia's hard-to-abate sectors. In 2023, Bioenergy Australia released the Transitioning Australia Liquid Fuel Sector, the Role of Renewable Fuels report that identified that 45% of Australia's total energy use comes from liquid fuels, and therefore the immense task of decarbonising our economy will be near impossible without the urgent deployment and development of low-carbon liquid fuels for hard-to-abate sectors. Given Western Australia's resource sector's heavy reliance on liquid fuels, this task is particularly critical for this state. If we fail to act now, not only do we risk failing to meet these targets, but we risk missing the economic opportunity that is well and truly being grasped by other nations. These opportunities were identified in Australia's bioenergy roadmap, with it highlighting that 10% of 10 billion in annual GDP per annum could be added over the next decade through development of a mature bioenergy sector, with over 26,000 new jobs, the majority in regional areas. Now is the time to capitalise on these opportunities, and Western Australia is poised to take a leading role in developing Australia's low-carbon liquid fuel industry. With its agricultural strength, refining capabilities and stakeholders right across the value chain ready to act, Western Australia is a leader in Australia's clean energy transition. Today, I encourage you to engage in discussions about opportunities and challenges of developing how low-carbon liquid fuels industry can develop. To capture your thoughts, questions and ideas, please scan the QR code displayed on the screen, or will be displayed on the screen at some point, and your contributions will be compiled and discussed in more detail during the final session, where we will hold a facilitated workshop. In this session, we aim to identify the action strategies that industry and government can work together to accelerate the development of this sector. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the Honourable Jackie Jarvis, MLC, West Australian Minister for Agriculture, Food, Forestry and Small Business. Thank you, Minister.
Flynn. Look, I too want to start by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and recognise their connection to this land on which we meet, pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend those respects to other First Nations people in the room today. I also want to acknowledge my parliamentary colleague Jessica Shaw, Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier, who is here today representing Rhys Whitby, our Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Action. I can't remember his full title, but it's you get the gist. And so you're very lucky to have Jess here, who obviously has a engineering background, and this kind of stuff is her passion, so she'll do a fantastic job representing Minister Whitby today. So thank you to Bioenergy Australia for bringing us all together today. As Flynn said, West Australia has the potential to be a powerhouse in the low-carbon liquid fuels area. Our state is well positioned to be at the centre of this industry with ample feedstock and key infrastructure. And I know some of you have done some tours over the last few days, and if you're not from WA, I hope you've enjoyed that time you've spent down in Kwinana looking at our ports, our rail systems. We obviously have a lot of land across regional Western Australia available for production. And of course, as Flynn mentioned, we have a strong local demand for these fuels. And we always think of the mining and resources sector as a massive user for those biofuels. But we also have a very large state with a very small population. I actually gave someone a stat earlier. You know, our population is just nudging the 3 million mark. It's going up significantly every day. I think we have something like 1,500 new people coming to Western Australia each week. But most of us live here in in metropolitan Perth. I live here 90% of the time. I actually get home occasionally to regional WA. But our population in regional Western Australia outside the metropolitan area is still less than 1 million people. So if you think about Western Australia on a map, there's a lot of area and not many people. We have lots of small communities. And I was speaking earlier to Horizon Power. We still have very remote communities who are powered, who get their electricity supply from diesel generators. We have challenges that come from having a very small population in a very, very large landmass. And biofuels could be a significant game changer for us. So they have immense potential. We also, again, talk about mining and resources, but the ag sector itself is a massive user of diesel. So we currently use a large amount of fossil fuel-based liquid fuels like diesel and jet fuel. They are essential for our economy. We have an economy that is built around fly-in, fly-out workforce. We have, obviously, mining, heavy transport, construction, aviation, and agriculture itself is a massive user of diesel. So in 2023, WA imported 1 billion litres of jet fuel and 7.9 billion litres of diesel, accounting for 24% of the national diesel use. And again, let's put that into perspective. We have 10% of the population and we're using 24% of the national diesel use. It meets 88% of our agricultural energy needs. And there are limited alternatives for the short to medium term. And if any of you have had the opportunity to get out to our grain growing regions, out to our wheat belt, you know, it is dominated by massive headers. It's if you haven't seen the face of modern agriculture, you'll be blown away by farmers who have $1 million headers, who own their own semi-trailers, who have lots of massive machinery to harvest grain and get it to port. So agriculture is in a prime position to not only supply the biomass feedstocks, but also to consume that renewable diesel. And obviously the closer we can manufacture it to the actual users, the better. Western Australian farmers are also acutely aware of their emissions because we are an export focused. So 90% of what we grow in broadacre crops in Western Australia is exported. We are trading on the international market, and I was talking to some people earlier who are involved in the ag sector who also highlighted how savvy Western Australian farmers are about understanding their carbon footprint. So we know that agriculture can provide biomass feedstocks, and we know that we have all the ingredients we need to do that. And I say this very proudly around the world. WA farmers are among the most efficient dryland farmers in the world. Our grain is rain-fed. We don't irrigate. We have not cleared land for farming since the early 1980s. And yet year on year our yields are increasing because of our fantastic plant breeding that we're doing here in Western Australia, and we are making sure that we get more grain from the same amount of land. And we've had a saying here at our Department of Primary Industries for many years, more grain from less rain, which is what we continue to get. Our harvest has started, so the very first shipment of well, I'll call it grain, but canola, obviously an oil seed. Our very first delivery went into the CBH bins down in Esperance earlier this week. That is the start of what will be a probably 17 million tonne harvest this year. 17 million tonnes is a little bit above average. We've had some years where we've had up to 24 million tonnes. And as I said, 90% of everything we harvest goes for export. So at the moment, 90% of our canola production is exported to the EU, the US and Singapore for biofuel refining, representing half of Australia's total canola exports into these markets. We also have a range of biomass feedstocks, which include the crop residues from our wheat, our oats, our barleys and our oilseeds. We obviously have tree crops such as oil mallees. We have a thriving blue gum industry that is currently exporting blue gum chips for paper. And we have other agroforestry assets, including some stranded agroforestry assets where trees, plantations were planted in areas where climate change has meant that it's no longer sustainable. We also have a long-standing tradition here of where farmers can't grow crops on particular parts of their land due to perhaps salinity. They'll grow other things. They'll grow, they'll grow things like oil mallees, or they'll regenerate that bushland into bushland. And as I said, we haven't cleared land for farming for many, many, many decades. So look, thanks to advanced planting practices, we've seen those significant crop yields, and that actually provides opportunities for biofuel. We additionally are seeing more and more farm businesses planting native eucalypts alongside farming, their traditional farming practices. And again, this has been a long-standing tradition in our farming practices here in Western Australia. Canola remains a key crop in WA, production over the last 5 years averaging 2.2 million tonnes per annum, and it contributes around $1.2 billion annually to the state economy. So in addition to canola though, there are vast opportunities for those dispersed but low-value feedstocks that we get from the residue of those other, the wheat, the oats, the barley. We also have, a tradition of pelletising those low-value feedstocks for stock feed. So we can pelletise those items, whether it's used for stock feed or to feed the biofuels industry. I think the bigger challenge is perhaps the competition from export markets as a recognised role as a food producer. So farmers will grow what they get the best value for and what they get the best return for. And so, earlier this week I was at a conference where everyone was talking about oats, oat milk. We need so many more oats. We're doing so much more oat processing. I've gone on trade missions where, we see our near neighbours like Vietnam and Indonesia rely heavily on our barley for beer brewing. We have oat production. We have a massive amount of oats going into China. They have a booming economy, and people who are really interested in having things like oat rice and oat noodles to replace rice from a health perspective. So the bigger challenge, I think, for this industry is to offer value to farmers who can actually see that this is commodity should be going into this market. Our West Australian's wheat belt region, our agricultural growing region, and recent analysis indicates that this region alone, the agricultural biomass could, in theory, meet much of WA's diesel demand without compromising sustainable soil and land management. So the WA state government is absolutely interested in supporting this developing industry. So interest in developing advanced biofuels has grown significantly in WA over recent years. And there are a number of proposed projects in WA, and I know that some of you went down to Kwinana to see some of those proposals, which includes obviously BP's Australia Kwinana Energy Hub, the Future Energy Park in Narrogin, Renewable Bio in Esperance. There's Wheatbelt Connect, the joint venture between ANZ Impex and Qantas. And these projects represent a combined capital expenditure of around $2 billion, targeting production of over 1.5 billion litres of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. We know this has the potential to create around 2,000 construction jobs and more than 350 ongoing jobs. I'm really happy that more than half of this investment is in regional WA. The opportunity for regional WA to be involved in producing sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, bioethanol, synthetic gas, biochar and wood vinegar is huge. So the Cook Labor government is supportive of industry growth, and we have initiatives like the Clean Energy Future Fund, Investment Attraction Fund, New Industries Fund and our Collie Industry Transition Fund. And we've supported projects such as $4.72 million for the Narrogin Future Energy Park development from the Investment Attraction Fund, $2 million from the Clean Energy Future Fund to Future Energy Australia for high temperature pyrolysis plant to produce renewable diesel. Additionally, the state government is also supporting projects by progressing lease negotiations with Cargill Australia for land at Kwinana Strategic Industrial Area. And we're actually funding trials. So we are building a massive public transport system called MetroNet, and I understand that Main Roads, the agency in charge of that, has been actually trialling renewable diesel trials in its heavy plant and equipment, and there are other government agencies who are trialling the use of renewable diesel products. So we're certainly on the journey with you. So as I said, West Australia is uniquely positioned to support sustained advanced biofuel industry, and agriculture is ready to supply the necessary sustainable feedstock. Existing supply chains are in place. We have strong demand for locally produced low carbon liquid fuels, and we have access to a highly skilled workforce. Low carbon liquid fuels have the potential to be a key component of our renewable energy mix, whilst addressing climate change, fuel security, help towards land restoration, and of course waste management and full utilisation of our cropping land. A thriving bioenergy and bioproduct industry will add value to WA's regional economies and communities. And I look forward to hearing more about how this industry will help WA on its journey towards net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So we're going to now hear from one of those Western Australian farmers. We're delighted to have our keynote speaker with us here today, Brad Jones from Bungulla Farming, and a former Australian Cropping Farmer of the Year. Brad farms around 11,000 hectares of wheat, barley, canola and lupins, in addition to running an aerial spraying business. He is no stranger to innovative ideas and diversification, and we are happy to have him here to share his insight into the opportunities the low carbon fuels industry presents for Western Australia's agricultural sector. Thanks, Brad.
Okay, from paddock to plane. So agriculture 10 years ago, we were all about food and fibre, and now we're food, fibre and energy. Two fundamentals of life are food and energy, and the best thing about ag is we can participate in both of them. Okay, so diversity is the best form of insurance that you can have. And from an agronomic point of view, we like to have a very diverse production system. So as mentioned before, like we are wheat, barley and canola. Our volume can be increased by changing our cropping systems. So in a future graph, you'll see how the pricing signals that we understand the most is where we'll follow with our crop types. So we can only contribute a small volume compared to the overall volume required. For instance, my aviation business, we use about 400,000 litres of Jet A1 per annum, and our farming system uses about 200,000 litres of diesel. So everything that we can produce on farm, we can actually use for our own fueling systems, which would mean no export whatsoever. The diversified system are more resilient to the market and environmental fluctuations. So for instance, if we have an early start, we can swing into canola. If we have a late start, we'll swing out of canola. So we do actually have to play the game a little bit to how Mother Nature actually gives us the signals. The market signals have to be conveyed through pricing because that's what we understand the most. If the dollars aren't there, we will swing away from that system very much. In 2022, we had very strong canola prices, and that was followed by, in 2021 we had very strong canola prices, which was followed by 2022 as the biggest canola crop grown in WA, which equated to about 4 million tonnes. We need policies to support our production systems, and it needs to go right through the value chain. I know when we were at Kwinana on Wednesday, we were talking about the requirement, like how we all would like a government mandate that'll give us a little bit of investment horizon, which was important to keep those dollars engaged. So this is canola over the last 5 years. As you can see, when I was talking about that little spike before, which is in the 2021 and 22 seasons, that followed by massive swings in the canola plantings. It's a bit of a rubbery looking bunch of lines there, but that is what drives us into our production systems. This is 60 years of canola production in WA, and as you can see, it was very flat line for the beginning, But as soon as the biofuel market started to build in Asia and US and the EU, away we went, which resulted in the rather large plantings and production systems of recent times. So this is the CAG price over the last 11 years. So CAG being the genetically modified canola. So how the system works is we're priced on a base price, and then we have an oil bonification on that. So it's in our best interest to create as much oil as part of our system as we can, and we get rewarded for that. In the future, as technology and breeding continues, our canola system will become better. So we will be producing more, and we will be producing better quality product for the biofuels industry. So here's just a few stats that'll probably sit canola or sit our production system in WA and how much we're going to, and show how much of a drop in the ocean we are. So the Qantas mandate is for 10% SAF by 2030, which equates to about 600 million litres per annum of neat SAF. Out of the Perth hub now, they're currently using 300 million litres of Jet A1. And as the Perth hub increases, the likelihood of the volume required will increase as well. If we just have one flight per day, which between Perth and Heathrow, the number's missing there, but that one flight requires 100,000 litres. So they use about the aircraft that takes off with 125,000 litres, so about 150 tonne, and it uses 100,000 litres of that. So if we equate that to if we start to transport that to the biggest canola crop we've ever grown in WA, and I'm about to show my lack of knowledge in the refining process, but 4 million tonnes of canola at a 45% equals 1.8 million litres. So if we bring that into QF9 between Perth and Heathrow, that's only 18 flights using neat SAF, or if the 10% mandate, that's 180 flights. That's not even half a year operation with our whole canola crop. So this is our on-farm, we were baselined in 2023. So you can see our biggest crop residues, fertiliser, and our challenge in the future will be how we can use both. We can use one to benefit the other. So we can actually start capturing our residue, converting it into a fertiliser, and then putting it back into our production system. As I mentioned before, all the fuel that we use on farm now, our whole canola program would be absorbed just fueling ourselves, and then we'd still be importing it. So in the future, we need a market-accepted sustainability metric that can be measured and can be tradable. So as we start to trade our commodity along the value chain, we need to be able to attach our sustainability units that we have created so it can be used all along the value chain so everyone, all the participants can actually benefit from it. We're not trying to be altruistic here. Everyone is going to have to lean into it a little bit, but as soon as the market becomes distorted, if someone along the value chain decides that they want to create a bigger margin, turn it into a cash cow, growers will disengage. They will swing to another crop in a heartbeat. The only place that the value of something like that can be realised will be at the consumer face. So when that passengers sitting on QF9 between Perth and London, they'll tick that box and pay that extra for their sustainability or for their use of the biofuel, and then it'll come back down to the value chain. We won't be realising any extra value from that. It'll just allow us to participate in the process. Then we've got to start talking about volatility that we have in our production systems with our weather. Like, that is our biggest influence at the moment. Any farmers that you know, the first thing they'll probably do when they wake up in the morning is look at what the weather's going to be. They don't even talk to anyone except for the weatherman. It's a pretty sad indication of what drives our life. So there's a pressing need for adaptation to ensure that sustainability and productivity along the supply chain can continue. And again, it comes back to the market signals. So if we get the right signals and we do engage in the production systems, we will be able to provide the fuel the feedstock that's required for the fuel. As weather patterns become more unpredictable, the impact on us is profound. So we're talking about a 17 million tonne crop this year. In 2022, there was less hectares planted, but there was a 24 million tonne crop. So if the weather plays our game, we can produce. But the weather is so volatile out there that it's very hard for us to be able to give you a clear horizon of what we're going to be able to produce year in, year out. Again, the government needs to create a mandate, however modest it's going to be, to keep investment on the horizon. So this is 100 years from 1907, when our family farm was first settled, to 2017. That's 100 years of our rainfall data. As you can tell, the volatility with that. So trying to manage that, you can see why it's a bit consuming in our thought process. This is what technology and breeding has done. So since in the last 60 years, we've had that increase with all the core commodities that we produce throughout the world. Our climate hasn't helped that. That's been technology and breeding. Okay, so thank you very much for bringing ag into the conversation. As I said before, it's nice to be able to present at this forum. As you can see, like, we live with markets, we live with FX, but our biggest influence is always going to be weather. Mother Nature, she can be really, really kind at some point, but sometimes she can just be a real bitch. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. So we're going to move into the first session of today, the role of low-carbon liquid fuel industry in the decarbonisation and economic development. This session is being sponsored by the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and we are thrilled to have with us today Ms Jess Shaw, MLA, local member for Swan Hills and Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier. As a representative of the Honourable Rhys Whitby, MLA, the Western Australian Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Action, who sends his apologies today. Thank you, Jess.
Kaya Wanju. I also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge my parliamentary colleague, Jackie Jarvis. Minister Whitby does send his apologies for not being able to attend today, but I really am glad to be here. I had a decade working in the energy industry before I ran for Parliament. I look after energy policy for the Premier as his Parliamentary Secretary in State and Industry Development, Jobs and Trade. And I've just been made an honorary life member of the Australian Institute of Energy, and in a few months will return to the energy industry. And I tell you this because I know the difference between stationary energy and transport fuels, transport energy. I know that this session is about liquid fuels and their role in decarbonisation, but that's not the speech that I've been given to deliver to you today. So I just want to tell you, I do know the difference, but nonetheless, we are here to talk about decarbonisation and the importance of that to the Western Australian economy and the opportunities that present from decarbonisation. So given we're all passionate about it, I do hope what I'm about to say is a little bit interesting nonetheless. Economies rise and fall according to energy. The age of steam started the Industrial Revolution. It transformed Britain into a superpower. The age of oil supercharged the US economy. It led to fishing villages in the Gulf becoming global cities. The age of renewables will bring great change too. Western Australia is poised to benefit like few other places on Earth. The Cook Labor government knows the challenge and wants to seize the opportunities. We know the opportunities too. We're legislating our net zero emissions target by 2050. We've set a date for retiring state-owned coal-fired power. And we're investing $5.4 billion in wind, storage and transmission. We've already made significant headway in our journey. Last year, more than a third of Western Australia's stationary energy came from renewables. That was thanks to an increasingly clean energy mix that combines rooftop solar, onshore wind and large-scale storage. Big batteries are already keeping the lights on in Western Australia. Soon we will have access to one of the biggest batteries in the world. This will allow us to meet peak electricity demand with energy that is secure, reliable and affordable. To support this, we're expanding our state's electricity network. As part of our most recent state budget, we've invested $324 million in Western Power. That will allow it to plan for clean energy-linked projects that will ensure households and businesses can access clean, affordable and reliable energy for decades to come. Some think of decarbonisation and see the challenges. Here in WA, we prefer to think of the opportunities. WA has everything it needs to become a clean energy superpower: wind, sunshine and land. We already support the world's energy needs through energy exports. That means we have the workforce, infrastructure and trade relationships needed to decarbonise the world. Our state already punches above its weight in mineral exports too. We're helping the world decarbonise through exporting critical minerals, rare earths and lithium. It puts us in a unique position to be an energy transition leader. Nowhere is this more evident than in our state's north. There, the decarbonisation opportunities are immense, while the challenges take on a different scale. We know the Pilbara has what's needed to support this energy transition. Our state's north has amazing solar resources, access to significant wind resources, and the world's largest carbon capture facility in operation. We want to see the Pilbara region be home to hydrogen, green steel, and advanced manufacturing industries. To do that, the Cook Labor government is committed to ensuring the economic environment is right for businesses. If we're to decarbonise the Pilbara, we must bring industry and communities together to see the value in shared infrastructure that can transport renewable energy to businesses and households. Following the work of former Energy Minister Bill Johnston, we're doing this through the Pilbara Roundtable. This provides us with a forum to reaffirm our commitments to shared goals, agree on the required infrastructure, and establish the right regulatory settings. I would observe, just as an aside, that all good ideas have their time. When I was working in industry in the mid-2000s, the green link that we're now working on in the Pilbara was called the East Pilbara Link, was progressed under the Carpenter Labor government, but then unfortunately put on ice. It's fantastic that under Premier Cook, we're now seeing industry and government coming together to deliver this critical infrastructure. Make no mistake, this work will underpin our state's transition. The Pilbara contributes 40% of our state's emissions and generates just 2% of its energy from renewable sources. This must change. Already, our commitment to working with industry and traditional owners is evident in our plan for transmission infrastructure on the Burrup Peninsula. We've been clear with businesses and traditional owners that the region needs to connect industry to renewable energy. The network will be privately funded. It will be supported by the Commonwealth Government's $3 billion Rewiring the Nation funding and supported by regulatory overhauls and community engagement. This is a new way of working in our state. Importantly, we're addressing long-standing issues in the Pilbara by developing common user infrastructure. We're working with traditional owner groups who have formed an alliance to collaborate with government to ensure on-country impacts are minimised. And we want to extend this approach to the goldfields. Soon we will convene the Goldfields Regional Network, which will address similar challenges in our state's other economic engine room. Sourcing and transmitting renewable energy will open a new frontier for Western Australia. But still, our gas industry will be critical to Western Australia. It's a creator of jobs and economic growth, and it can shape the future of a global hydrogen industry as we transition away from fossil fuels. Gas will remain a critical part of our energy mix for some time to come as our established industries grapple with the challenges of decarbonisation. This is the case for many countries throughout the world. Gas is a flexible source of electricity that can firm renewables and displace higher emitting fuel sources, enabling our trading partners' decarbonisation. It will also support our burgeoning mining and minerals processing sectors. The opportunities for renewable hydrogen, however, are immense, and while we recognise the role of gas, we must lift our eyes to new technologies like hydrogen and its derivatives. Our industry's development has been demonstrated through the approval of projects to export renewable hydrogen, the use of renewable hydrogen in remote locations, the distribution of renewable hydrogen in WA gas networks, and the operation of refuelling facilities for hydrogen vehicles. Much as we'd all like to decarbonise as soon as humanly possible, we cannot turn off the gas tap tomorrow. Processes, jobs and livelihoods depend on us managing an orderly transition. We must also look to the carbon that we emit through carbon capture, utilisation and storage. CCUS has a critical role to play in this transition. I recently made the point in a speech to Parliament that every IEA scenario factors CCS into a net zero scenario in some form or another. Of the countries with net zero pledges in place, around half have identified CCS as contributing in some way to meeting their Paris targets. Not only can CCUS help address carbon emissions from oil and gas production, it can also play a role in decarbonising hard-to-abate industries such as cement and chemical manufacturing. It's a challenge, but one our state is determined to confront. Western Australia has enormous potential with infrastructure that can support the creation of CCS hubs that could support decarbonisation in manufacturing and energy production, attract significant overseas investment, and generate 37,000 construction jobs and 500 permanent roles. To make this all possible, we've enacted CCUS legislation. This will enable the transport and storage of greenhouse gases as well as the exploration of naturally occurring hydrogen. It will help lay the foundation of a cleaner energy future here in Western Australia. We know that transitioning to new energy sources will be hard. It represents an unprecedented economic transformation, but we are lucky here in Western Australia. Domestically, we have a clear pathway to net zero emissions. Globally, though, we also have a very important role to play. But we cannot do it alone. Government, industry and community must work together. Minister Jarvis has spoken about transport fuels. I've just addressed some aspects of stationary energy, but this government is serious about affecting change. The challenges are significant. No one's naive about that, but let's work together towards a more sustainable, secure energy future.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. So we're going to move into our panel session for today. I'd like to introduce our panellists. First, Brendon Buckley from the Australian Government Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communication and the Arts. Dr. Cathryn O'Sullivan from the CSIRO and James Boyle from Deloitte. Now, they're each going to talk one after the other. If you've got any questions, please hold them until our panel session at the end.
Thanks very much, Flynn, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. It's great to be able to speak to you all about what the opportunity of net zero is and how the Australian government is visualising it. There's sort of two other things I'd like to talk about today. One is about the role of the Australian government and what my specific role, the role of the department is as well. And then finally to talk about what we've heard. So we've done a lot of consultation on the policies that will help a low carbon liquid fuel industry and supporting the government in its efforts to fast track a low carbon liquid fuel industry in Australia. And I want to reflect back to you what we've heard through those consultations. Okay, first, so talking about what the opportunity is. Okay. So Australia relies on liquid fuels for over half of our final energy demand. So we've seen the decarbonisation of the electricity sector occurring quite rapidly now. We see the changes from out of coal, but liquid fuels is half of our energy demand. I think that's really important to reflect upon. And it makes up around 30% of our total emissions. Now, you might also be wondering why the Department of Transport, I'll shorten it for the purpose of today's discussion, the Department of Transport is interested in that from a federal perspective. Well, the transport sector makes up 70% of Australia's consumption of conventional fossil fuels. So our pathway to decarbonisation for transport is very much linked to the decarbonisation of fossil fuels, of liquid fuels, I should say. So the Australian government is committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And as I said, we've taken extensive consultation on the potential pathways to decarbonisation. So the net zero unit within our department has been leading those conversations and thinking about how the different transport sectors are going to decarbonise. And those hard to abate sectors in the transport sector include aviation, heavy vehicles, rail and maritime. But we know it's broader than that as well. So we're also obviously working with other agencies within the Commonwealth. We're working to support agriculture, decarbonisation, mining and also manufacturing sectors as well. So it's big for a lot of sectors of the economy. So the Transport Sector Plan, which I think a number of you have seen, the first version of it, we've come out for consultation on it. It will provide a strategy to reduce emissions across the transport infrastructure sectors and support national and international commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide future market certainty to investors. And so the pathway for different sectors, they've all got their different ways of decarbonising in the transport mode. But critically, low carbon liquid fuels is going to play a part in a number of them, as I've mentioned before. What I'll put up now is the slide and the information that we had in our transport sector plan. Now, one thing that I'll just say before I go into what I'd say about this part of it is, this is what we use to consult on. So we've been receiving your feedback and we've been receiving feedback from the community on it. So this might not be exactly what the pathways are that you agree with. This is what we initially came out with based on the research that we'd done to begin with, but your views will be incorporated into this. But critically, in our first cut of the transport sector plan that we came out to consult on, you can see now, in the short term, in the medium term, and even to 2050, low carbon liquid fuels are going to play a key part of decarbonisation for heavy vehicles, for rail, for maritime, for aviation. And for some of those sectors, aviation and maritime in particular, I would say, it's going to be longer than 2050. So the need for low carbon liquid fuels on our journey to net zero and beyond is critical. But it's not just about decarbonisation for the Australian government. So you would have seen that there was major announcements made at budget this year through the Future Made in Australia agenda. And importantly, as that they announced some priority sectors as part of the Future Made in Australia, and one of those is the growth of the low carbon liquid fuel industry. And as part of that, there were some announcements as well that came with that to sort of support the building blocks, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Low carbon liquid fuels like sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel are vital for decarbonising hard to abate sectors, as I've mentioned. And Australia has advantages like renewable feedstocks, supply chains, and renewable energy potential to develop a range of feedstocks and become competitive in low carbon liquid fuel production. Developing a domestic low carbon liquid fuel industry aligns with making Australia a renewable energy superpower and securing economic resilience under the Future Made in Australia plan. So this is more than decarbonisation, securing Australia's place in the world as we go forward and also securing the jobs of the future as well. And that's how our government's sort of viewing the opportunities in the low carbon liquid fuel sector. So as I mentioned, the budget provided $18.5 million over 4 years to develop a certification scheme for low carbon liquid fuels. And that'll be by expanding the Guarantee of Origin scheme. And that's critical, not only to make sure that we can verify the emissions reductions from low carbon liquid fuels, and not only to support the increasing emission reductions throughout the supply chain, but it's critical for the other potential support mechanisms and policies that may be put into place in the future. The government's also committed $1.7 billion over the next decade in the Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund, which will be delivered by ARENA, our Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And that'll be used to commercialise net zero innovations. And again, critically, low carbon liquid fuels will take part in that and will have a share of that funding over the next 10 years. And that will be critically important, which I'll touch on later again as well, to make sure that we can commercialise some of these nascent technologies. These initiatives aim to facilitate the required private sector investment and to establish competitive industry in Australia. The R&D grants and the certification scheme are some of the key building blocks, as I've said, to support the industry. And we've been consulting industry on further supply and demand side measures and assessing the demand side policies to ensure a comprehensive approach to scale up a domestic industry. So this was the consultation that we undertook. And what I just mentioned to begin with, I know some of you will know this, but I think it's fair to point it out again about what the role of the department is in this. And critically, our role is to provide advice to the government. We're not decision makers, so I won't be advising or announcing anything here today. So you can ask, but I won't be able to tell. But critically for that to happen, I need, and the department needs, your views and your perspectives and your intelligence to do that. And so that's why we undertook the consultation. And that's why we were so thankful that we got the submissions that we did. We received, well, it's got 116 in here. I understand that the latest count was we had 122 submissions. So we had a number of face-to-face meetings, and I know a number of you have taken a lot of your time out to speak to us and to help us to understand the industry, the potential, so that we can provide advice to government so they can make the decisions that they need to make to support the industry. So as I mentioned, we've led consultations in Australia with the release of that consultation paper. And critically, we're also working very closely with the Department of Treasury and the Department of Climate Change. Again, you can see that's the two key pillars of the low carbon liquid fuel opportunity from the government's perspective. It's the Future Made in Australia agenda and it's decarbonisation. So once we've delivered that to government will obviously make their decisions, and it'll be a point of their time in the future to decide what they want to do and when they want to announce it. So I guess it's sort of watch here. But what I wanted to do today is just outline what do we hear through those consultations, because I know that a number of times what I hear from stakeholders is we tell you a lot, you take it all in, we might hear an announcement at the end of the day, but we don't really know what you did with that information. And so it's forums like this that I'm really excited to come out and talk to you about. What did we hear? The other thing that I'll mention with that is just a shout out, I guess, to Bioenergy Australia, because they've really been able to get industry together to have a sort of a consensus view where they can. That is really important for government to sort of help de-risk their decision making. And so, you know, a lot of the things that I'll say now about what we heard through consultation probably won't come as a surprise to you. You may have differing views on what the overall message is, and there may be some stuff at the edges, but I think as far as consultation goes, one of the key takeouts from me from this particular consultation and what we heard was just the consensus that came across in terms of the points of view of industry. So the first thing to mention is the outline of the opportunities for Australia. So supporting a domestic industry in Australia will have several long-term benefits. And obviously it's not just decarbonisation, it's not just having a domestic industry, but it's increasing fuel security, it's having the environmental benefits, it's strengthening the regional economies, diversifying income streams for farmers, health improvements and promotion of sustainable practices. I'd also just quickly mention that we did have we had some good feedback from climate advocacy groups as well. And they also recognise the benefit of low carbon liquid fuels and support investment in the sector. One thing that they do point out, though, is that in the policy design, they want us to be cautious to make sure that we don't disincentivise more efficient paths in some sectors. And so that's a key thing of the transport sector plan, is to try and understand that as well. And outside of transport as well, there's different mechanisms as well, but low carbon liquid fuels definitely has its place. We heard very clearly that both demand and supply side measures in concert is what's going to help to have a sustainable domestic industry. A production incentive on its own is unlikely to sustain a domestic industry, but it can help kickstart it. On the supply side measures, we heard that the preferred measure is a hybrid of support to address both capital and OPEX expenditure of low carbon liquid fuels facilities, with the CapEx mainly focused on R&D to support different projects to come through to commercialisation, and that operational expenditure support to help them actually start up production. There were some other supply-side actions that were raised in consultations, such as feedstock retention and development of a national strategy, localised support for infrastructure, technical standards for low-carbon liquid fuel distribution and storage, low-interest loans, workforce development, the GO scheme and carbon accounting, and aligning sustainability criteria with international standards. So as you can sort of see here, some of these will be the role of the Australian government and some will be the role of state government as well, and it's about us working together with industry to set up the right policy framework. On demand side measures, both a mandate and a low carbon fuel standard were supported. There was a clear preference for a low carbon fuel standard through the consultation, and I guess that just reflects the ability of that particular mechanism to have broad application and to have flexibility and to really focus on the carbon intensity reduction that we need. Quite importantly, I think from the consultation as well, is most industrial users support the introduction of regulated demand side measure as well. So it's not, obviously producers support it, but there is a bit of bias in that, of course. There's something for them in that particular market, in that market growing, but really importantly, the industrial users who will need the fuels supported the idea of a mandate. And we also heard just earlier from Brad as well about the support for that. So just that broad-based support is really important. There was views on the mandate design, and many support mandates tied to declining carbon intensity and its ability to drive emissions reductions. And there's also some views about having an initial mandate then leading into a low carbon fuel standards. On the low carbon fuel standard design, again, tied to declining carbon intensity, that came through quite strongly. And a trading mechanism to facilitate market development and set a buyout price for compliance to limit price impacts if production costs spike, which could happen due to weather, as Brad was mentioning before, or other changes that are happening geopolitically as well. And a proportion of the obligation to be met from domestic supply and a life cycle assessment criteria grounded in Australian conditions and aligned with international models. Critically, there was also broad support for the emissions and sustainability criteria that gets put into the mechanisms that are developed as well, linking both the supply side and demand side measures to the carbon intensity of the fuels. And there was some broad agreement on general sustainability criteria as well, such as the impact on land use, water, waste, employment conditions, and that all should form part of the incentives as well as being built in to the demand side measures as well. And you would have seen with the Future Made in Australia Act, there's the community benefits principles that they have with that as well. Others also suggest that additional criteria should include an assessment of the broader social and economic impacts and include job creation and community benefits, as I mentioned before. And so that's really great to hear, and it's about getting that balance right, and that'll be what our advice to government includes, and that'll go into their decision making as well. Critically, we also heard about the interaction with other federal net zero initiatives. So it's a busy policy space. Obviously, since the change of government in 2022, there's been a lot of new policies announced in the climate space, and we need to make sure that there's alignment between those policies. So that includes alignment of policies such as the safeguard mechanism, and also with the new vehicle efficiency standard. Critically as well, we heard about the need for support and some policy around feedstock and supply chain support. And the clear communication that came out of that was the development of a national feedstock strategy. The last thing that I just wanted to, so that was what we heard from consultation, and for sure grab me in some of the breaks if you don't agree with it or there are other points that you think we need to sort of highlight upon, but broadly I hope that reflects what you hope was heard through those consultation processes, and again I want to thank you for that. The last thing that I want to leave you with is just this chart, which will hopefully come up and hopefully be a good segue to Cathryn as well. Oop. So obviously at the moment we don't produce any low carbon liquid fuels like renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel. So the first thing is to get in the market to begin with. And obviously the most commercial pathway for that is the HEFA pathway, and we very much recognise that. This is what global production of HEFA looks like out to 2030, of low carbon liquid fuels, I should say, with the green one being that hydro processing or HEFA pathway. Now critically, that's great, and I think that's, it's obviously a clear pathway, and it's the most commercial pathway to start off with, and there's obviously a number of proponents that are looking to capitalise on that. But we will quickly run out of feedstocks that can feed that pathway. And Australia has a lot of feedstocks, which Cathryn will talk about for sure, and we need to figure out, and we need to have our policies designed in a way that obviously support the industry to start, but also support the industry to diversify to different pathways to process both renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel and low carbon liquid fuels generally, so we can unlock our vast amount of resources. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Brendon and Brad and all the previous speakers really for setting the scene perfectly for what I want to talk about. My name's Cathryn O'Sullivan. I'm a senior research scientist in the sustainability program within agriculture and food at CSIRO, and I also work into our Towards Net Zero mission. And within the mission, we have a low carbon liquid fuels portfolio of work that began with a focus on SAF as almost like the emerging use case, but has really quickly expanded to consider renewable fuels more broadly because of the recognition of the importance of all of the different hard-to-abate sectors. And as Brendon alluded to, what I really want to talk to today is taking what Brad really so clearly outlined and expanding on that to think about what does a future feedstock portfolio and a future farming system look like, and what might we have to do to get ourselves there. So this is some work that we did in collaboration with James's team from Deloitte, looking at modelling what the projected demand might be and also where we are at right now in meeting that demand. And what I really want to focus on here, the point I want to make, is that the myth that we don't have enough feedstock is both false and true at the same time. So if we take a very simplistic view that we want to replace all of the liquid fossil fuels that we currently use, it's true, we won't have enough feedstock. And I think Brad really clearly articulated the risks that if we focus in on one particular kind of feedstock, that's also true. We're not going to have enough feedstocks, even if we only focus on one industry like SAF. But if we scratch the surface, it is actually much more complex and nuanced than that. So what this graph shows is some modelling that we did that focused on the 12 existing major feedstocks. So that's things like canola, sugar, sorghum, agricultural residues, and wastes. And the purple that you can see in the background is just a superimposition of that demand out to 2050, focusing on those hard-to-abate industries. So that's thinking about aviation, mining, maritime, all the industries that we've been talking about today that don't have other options. They're hard to electrify. They need distance and load that can't be met easily with other options. And what you can see in green there is that with our focus on the current 12 major feedstocks, we can maybe achieve 50% of that demand. Now, that's not insignificant. We're talking about 100 petajoules potentially at 2050. That's a lot of energy met through that, but it is also really reliant on some of the things that Brad pointed out. It's at the whim of the weather. It requires focus from our farmers, which is going to require market signals and pricing signals to achieve that. And it also doesn't get us all the way there. However, if we lift our eyes beyond where we are now and think about what a future farming system might look like, one of the key points that we see is that we really need to diversify strongly that feedstock base. And this is some work that we've done based on a literature study which looked across all of the previous work that was done, and there's been a really, really concerted effort in the early 2000s on this, around Australia of what feedstocks might be possible. And this involves some pretty conservative estimates of what is harvestable in these. So we're not talking about going out and establishing bioenergy crops on all of the land or harvesting all of the residues. This has built-in conservative estimates. But if we look to expand the oilseeds that we currently have as much as we can within their agronomic fit in the landscape, but then also start to unlock the lignocellulosics, so things like agricultural residues that are harvestable, integrating those energy tree crops like the oil mallees and other short rotation eucalypts, thinking about grassy tree crops and other novel feedstocks that are coming through the pipeline like leaf oils and precision fermentation, and ultimately out to 2050 thinking about coming things like powder liquids, then we really do have a very significant feedstock base that we can draw on. However, all of these are not created equal in terms of their carbon intensity, and all of these are not created equal in terms of their price. So there will be decision points to be made along this. Our current thinking is that we need to encourage and build as many of these as possible because of the critical need of diversity, which again Brad touched on, not just within our cropping system, but within our farming system and our energy system as a whole. We need that diversity to distribute risk. So one of the other things I really quickly wanted to touch on was the role of agriculture in our national economy and the kinds of decisions that we're asking farmers to make. Now, as we move towards a net zero future and decarbonisation, we're going to be more and more reliant on our primary producers to do more for us. So a lot of what we need to replace from our fossil fuels is going to come from primary production. We're going to be asking not just for food and fibre and animal feed, we're also going to be asking for materials and energy feedstocks and land stewardship. Farmers are going to have to choose between growing trees and replanting and reforesting for nature-positive carbon farming and biodiversity markets. They're also going to be asked to grow feedstocks. They're going to be asked to grow timber and fibre and food and animal feed at the same time. And we need to give them the tools to help them make decisions and also the market and pricing signals to encourage change and allow them to actually operate in what is really a relatively high risk and low margin business model. And part of that, this is a very small part of it, but part of it is getting those sustainability credentials right. And at the moment, a lot of thinking in the sustainability credentials has gone into carbon intensity. And I think we are at a place now where we recognise the importance of getting the Australian farming system and how we practice farming and the efficiencies that our environment and landscape have forced upon our farmers, recognised in the global system, because we do operate very differently from a lot of the global north. But we need to move beyond that and also start to integrate a lot of the other metrics that people have been discussing. So things like water use efficiency, land use efficiency, social benefit, regional development. There's a lot of other metrics, and critically, we need to find ways to actually make those metrics enablers. So how do we allow them to make sure that value flows back to the farmer, to reward them for taking risks and to help them to make change in their system, both in terms of financing what they need to do and also being financially rewarded when they make those changes. So I wanted to focus in on just one example of what we see as a potentially nature-positive future farming system, which is based here in the southwest of WA. And this is thinking about agroforestry. And to be clear, this is just one example. There's many others that I could have chosen. But what I like about this example is that there is 20 to 30 years of research about the fit of particularly oil mallees, but other short rotation tree crops in farming systems, both here in the west and also over on the east coast. We have an understanding of the kinds of co-benefits that can come with integrated plantings of trees on farms. So it's things like you can get carbon sequestration in the standing stock because the stumps remain and you just come in and harvest the outer biomass every 3 to 5 years. You can get provision of animal shelter from those shelter belts. There's potential for native regeneration and biodiversity impacts if we use the right natives in the right places. They do contribute to hydrologic rebalancing, and we can help to address some of the dryland salinisation issues if we get these planted in the right places in the right ways. And they're also very low carbon intensity, and they tend to have quite positive land use change factors because of the nature positive factors in these systems. So the example on the right there is actually some research that was published back in 2017 out of Murdoch University, which is a techno-economic analysis and case study focused in on Katanning. They looked at a 100-kilometre radius around Katanning and made the assumption that if 55% of farmers introduced spaced shelter belt plantings of around 50% on their property, which granted is quite a big margin, but it's also a relatively small catchment, you could have about 15,000 hectares of mallees planted. And I won't dwell on the details here, but in their analysis they showed that this has the potential to produce around about 40 megalitres of fuel, and that's split between SAF and renewable diesel. And along with that, you will get biochar as a co-product. Excuse me. And of course, that land will still be productive for the crops and animals that are produced alongside those forestry products. And there's three things that are critical to this story. One is the background of research that's been done over decades that has told us what trees and where, how we should manage them, how they can be integrated into the landscape, and the benefits that can have. The other thing is the coming technology that's being developed for the improvements of processing of the material that comes out of these systems. So this is some work that's out of the National Renewable Energy Labs from the US, and we're in discussions with them about technologies that they are developing for the downstream processing of lignocellulosics. This is an example of their fast catalytic pyrolysis work. So this takes woody waste or agricultural residues, anything lignocellulosic and grassy or woody, processes it by traditional pyrolysis, but then they have this add-on technology at the end, which further treats that produced bio-crude oil, stabilising it and making it much higher quality, which makes it much more amenable to downstream processing and stable so that it can be stored and transported a longer distance. The other beautiful thing about this technology is that it's downscalable. So you can process around about 100 tonnes a day, which means it will enable regionalised nodes to be set up, like that Katanning example, where we can process the bulky material out in the regions where it's produced and just transport the concentrated biocrude and put the biochar back into the farming systems where it's created. The other really critical thing about this technology is that they've shown that over about the last decade to 15 years, they've been able to use their technology to reduce the minimum fuel selling price to about half. So they've gone from about over $6 per gallon US down to about $3. And their goal is to get it under $2 with technology developments. So again, just one example, but I think it shows that there's a need for R&D across the value chain to improve both the farming systems and the engineering processes. And really critically, I was having a chat with Brad before we started today, I think there's also a lot of R&D that's needed into developing the value chains themselves. So a lot of the barriers for these emerging and novel farming systems are beyond the technical. They are about what does the business model look like? How do we get the farmers connected with the refiners? Who's going to be the aggregator? Who's going to do the processing? How do we make sure the sustainability credentials service all of the players along that value chain? So there's a lot of systems integration research that's also needed beyond these technical fixes. But I think we do already have a lot of knowledge in this space, and it's a matter of just bringing it all together to develop these newer novel systems. So I'll leave it with that. This is just a little bit of information about the Towards Net Zero mission and how we see our role in the system. So I won't speak to that. I'll let you have a read. Thank you very much.
G'day. So, thank you very much to Bioenergy Australia for inviting us along. Thanks, mate. I can step forward. So, before I crack in, also thank you to representatives from WA Government for having us here. It's been really helpful, really interesting to hear some of the initial findings from the consultation process, and always, Cathryn, to hear the joy that is feedstock. So, I guess, you know, we hear a lot about how important low-carbon liquid fuels are for decarbonising our fuel mix, our transport sector. We've heard a little bit about the importance of low-carbon liquid fuels for economic diversification. I want to kind of get under the skin of that a little bit, right? Because this is not a standard industry. This is not something that we've done particularly, you know, swiftly at scale so far in Australia, but it is a market where there are proven technologies, where there are functional transactions happening in other parts of the world, right? So there are interesting lessons that we can draw from that. So really what I'm here to talk about are the co-benefits. If this ticks on, maybe. There we go. All right. So when we think about the types of benefits that developing domestic production of low-carbon liquid fuels can deliver, we are thinking about it from an economic perspective in, I guess, 3 buckets. So there are the direct benefits that you get from the capital investment in these projects. So that's the jobs and growth story that we're all very used to major capital projects talking about. Those are important. Those are the things that are going to drive decarbonisation. But on top of that, we've been talking a lot about the potential for the agricultural system to play a role here. That's a comparative advantage that Australia has, right? So the investment that this drives in our agricultural systems as they move away from just supplying food and fibre to food, fibre and energy will be really interesting, but it also becomes a really important driver for innovation in the ag system as we start to look for not just more ways to increase yield, but also to increase the energy content of some of these things. And it creates a whole lot of, if the price signals work and attached to sustainability criteria, incentives for on-farm decarbonisation. So it actually provides value to the farmer to engage in activities they otherwise wouldn't, if we have functioning markets. And the third piece, which I think is at this stage, at least in our view, probably the most underappreciated, is the development of the ecosystem around these projects, right? So the knowledge of how we actually build them and structure them is the fodder for the next set of innovation, right? So this is when we move away from just developing low-carbon liquid fuels into a lot of advanced biomanufacturing. So there are some quite interesting opportunities that will come about from having the skill sets and transitioning the skill sets that are in our major process engineering sectors into lower carbon sectors. So that's how we start to decarbonise not just the farming system, not just the fuels and transport, but actually the production systems of our economy. So just rolling through it, because we always like to start with jobs and growth, right? So these projects exist, they've been financed, they've been funded globally, and they're not small capex, right? So this is just a sample of some of the projects that have been either developed or have reached FID globally, and a decent chunk of them are multi-billion-dollar investments, right? So that means, you know, that there are pretty significant dollars flowing. It attracts FDI. It drives some really interesting dynamics on the ground. But importantly, a decent chunk of that money is invested locally. So that's, you know, into local supply chains, driving jobs and growth, basically maintaining some of the industries that we already have. What is really interesting, though, is when you compare low-carbon liquid fuels and investment in the production systems to some of the other systems that we'll be investing in the transition. So when you compare, say, the number of jobs that are involved in the construction phase of a solar farm or a wind farm, or the transmission that we desperately need to build out to bring all of the green electrons onto the grid, what we find is that actually on a, you know, job per dollar basis, low carbon liquid fuels and, you know, things that require really complicated process engineering are more jobs intensive, right? So they require more people to actually build the kit. In addition, we know from, you know, deployment of renewables that they're very capex intensive and very opex light. And so the jobs that are created are very, very focused. So sort of more than 90% of the jobs in renewables are in the construction phase, very few in the ongoing ops and maintenance. What we see in more OPEX-heavy processes, which is what low-carbon liquid fuels are, it's what hydrogen is to some extent, is that those jobs are more spread. So the jobs that will be created from these industries getting stood up, at least from the direct investment of the production facility, will be on a per dollar basis larger than we'd see from the energy systems. It's not saying that we shouldn't do both. We absolutely need to do both. It's saying that the economic profile of these industries is quite different. And that's a really important thing for players across the value chain to understand and get behind. But when we start to look upstream, and we've heard this a bit, and Cathryn, you've seen this one before, when we look at what the size of the opportunity is for the feedstocks industry. So Cathryn showed that chart that said, we can maybe service about 50% of demand from just the, crops that we have in rotation at the moment. When you actually look at the value that that creates, so this is basically plotting the emissions reductions that those fuels are delivering, how much feedstock volume, and it's looking at the size of the pie of selling those feedstocks onto the domestic market. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Like, we're not talking, a couple of 10, 20, $30 million transactions. We're talking about an industry that starts to look somewhere between sort of, say, $4 and $6 billion just providing feedstock into a domestic market. And that is without the diversification, that's without reaching the sort of scale that we need to actually stay consistent with our net zero targets. Right? So even as this industry starts to develop, the value that starts driving upstream is pretty significant. The downstream bit is the bit that I really like to talk about. So on the right-hand side for you, you can see the cluster that is Kwinana. It is a mess, but it's a very interesting mess. So one of the really interesting things when you co-locate a bunch of very, very complex industrial systems is they trade with each other. Right? And Kwinana is one of the biggest sort of clusters of industrial symbiosis globally. And what we see as sort of the core driver of that industrial symbiosis is the chemicals industry. Right? There's a whole lot of, feedstocks, and there's a whole lot of waste products that get circulated between those two. That's the system that a biorefinery is playing into. Right? And so when we start to think about some of the downstream benefits of building out these facilities, we'll start seeing them trading some of their co-products with facilities they're co-located with. We see potential for innovation in a range of downstream sectors that we also need to decarbonise. So that's things like in building materials. Obviously, we know that there's a fair chunk of agricultural inputs that will come out of some of this stuff. But there's also some really interesting ways that we can start value adding to chemicals that will also become available. So it's the option value that is created by actually getting these processes in the ground and live. But, as we've heard, it doesn't just happen, right? These projects don't magic themselves out of thin air. So when we look at the way that projects have developed globally, it's always an ecosystem, right? It's always the feedstock suppliers, it's always some intermediaries, and you have your engineering suppliers there who are making sure that the technicals of the project stack up. You have banks, you have finance, you need demand. All of those things have to come together and understand the ways that value and risk and reward can be shared across the actual project, right? At the moment, in the Australian market, we're creating a lot of knowledge about how to do this. Right? So we don't unlock that economic potential unless we get the projects off the ground. We have that knowledge waiting to be tapped into, and we need to start thinking about how we can scale it up across the market. That means thinking about how we're actually going to get to price discovery in this, given that Australian prices are not necessarily initially going to be consistent with global pricing. It means thinking about better ways that we can actually unlock the funding for innovation and drive that forward. It means actually understanding what the risk management practices look like, both in terms of on-farm, where we've got pretty sophisticated systems, but what that means for a refinery that's got to produce product on a fairly regular basis. And it means thinking about both the skills development we need and the labour productivity that we're going to actually need to unlock to make sure that this is sustainable into the future. So as we start to turn these projects from PDF documents into real, living, breathing, functional machines, we need to be thinking about all of the people who are involved in those processes. Who are the ones who are going to go on to create the next items of economic value? So what I wanted to leave you with is this. At the moment, we have a small handful of projects in development. So a small handful of either HEFA projects, alcohol to jet projects, we've got some fish-to-chop projects in there, some power to liquids projects. But the pipeline is small, right? And not all of those projects are going to make it through, right? We typically observe that sort of, you know, for every 3 or 4 projects in the pipeline, maybe 1 or 2 will make it to the market. So if we want to achieve the kind of scale that we're talking about, both to unlock the economic benefits, but also to deliver the decarbonisation we need to remain globally competitive and relevant, we're going to need to seriously scale up the pipeline. It's going to be fun.
Thank you, everyone. So we only have Brad for a few more minutes because he has to step away for another appointment. You've missed it? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, so we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A before morning tea. We've got a few roving microphones, I believe. Maybe to get us started, I might start with you, Brendon. Thank you for sharing some of the feedbacks and themes from the industry consultation that the department has done on low carbon liquid fuels. I think the consultation that's happened and what we saw today, or what you outlined today, is really encouraging, and the direction, I think, of the conversation is really encouraging. Could you give us a sense on where to from here, from a government policy decision-making and policy-making sense, particularly around supply and demand-side policy and what that looks like?
Yeah, I can. Thanks very much, Flynn. So I'll be able to tell you some things which is more around process than it is about timing, but it gives you an indication of some, I guess, the potential of when the decision might be announced. So some of you might know this and some may not, but generally the federal government has sort of 2 key budget processes that it runs per year. One's in May, which is the big budget, and then there's the MyEFO process, which happens later in that same calendar year. That's where we are at the moment. So there's a lot of decision making happening right at the moment. The Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet is meeting all through October. And government will make their decisions on a number of things, and they like to make it all at the same time because that way they're able to prioritise where they spend their money. So that's where we are at the moment. So we'd expect that some of those decisions will be considered through this MyEFO process. That's where our advice is going to. Then, post that, there's always the timing of when those announcements are made, and obviously that's a decision again for government to make about what decisions they make and when they decide to announce it. I guess the only other thing that I'd point out, which we don't really play in as a department, but it's just an observation that we're also then coming up to an election as well, and so I think governments will consider have other considerations that they make in terms of what decisions they make and when they decide to announce them. So the next stage definitely is a government decision-making process, and then it's an announcement about what's going to happen next. And I guess critically after that, then there's going to be some more opportunity then to be able to shape whatever it is that the government decision makes. There's some more detail that we'll need to get into post that we'll need to work with you on to make sure that we're getting the settings right.
Thank you. So if you do have any questions, just throw your hand up and we'll get you a mic. Maybe an extension to that. Obviously, in other parts of the world, you've talked to what the federal government's doing. Obviously, states, we're here for the Western Australian Low Carbon Liquid Fuels Summit, and state action can be very impactful as well, and we've seen that in other countries, particularly in the US. Maybe a question for James, given all the conversations that Deloitte has facilitated with industry on this, but where do you see the role, I guess, potentially for state government that can be impactful in a complementary way to what the federal government's doing?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. I guess we would see the federal government's role in the sort of like market-wide, market-shaping initiative. So that's things like the GO scheme. They're really helpful. They provide a floor to all of the transactions that will take place in the market. Whereas state governments have to deal with projects, right? They have to deal with really, really specific, complicated, idiosyncratic things. So I guess we see maybe 3 main roles for state governments in this space. One is around making sure that the feedstock and feedstock markets are developing well. We've got really good primary industry departments in each state who who are playing really important roles there and making sure that feedstock is both available, but also that the farmers have all of the information available to them to make the right decisions based on price. The second is around project development and facilitation. So we see state governments playing a really key role in supporting projects moving through stages of the life cycle. So with co-investment, with some grants, but also in terms of approvals and facilitation, so making sure that we've got, you know, the right infrastructure and services able to connect through, land use planning, things like that. And the third is then, you know, some of the enabling factors that are relevant for places, right? So that might be around workforce, it might be around the capability development within departments and within the wider ecosystem, but really those are the three places that, you know, there are often place or state-specific considerations where state governments need to play a role, and it's sort of less of an easy space for the federal government to play.
Thanks, James. Any questions from the audience? All right, I'll keep asking questions. So, so maybe to Cathryn and Brad. So, Cathryn, in your presentation, and I guess Brad, you kind of outlined obviously the might or the vast feedstock resources we have in Australia, obviously, and in particular Western Australia. Beyond obviously our you know, a huge canola production capacity, when it comes looking ahead to some of the feedstocks, particularly around agricultural residues, interested to understand, because feedstock obviously is really makes or breaks a project in a lot of ways. And so what's it going to take in terms of collection, aggregation, transportation, processing, etc., to be able to, you know, unlock those feedstocks for developers to be able to access them at a price that works, that they can take, you know, contracts that they can get financing off the back of. Interested in your thoughts on that.
I guess I can start with a really high-level comment, and then maybe Brad can fill in some of the details. From an R&D perspective, I think there's already evidence out there that tackles what I see as one of the critical questions, is how much of that biomass is actually needed in the system. We all know it plays a critical role in preserving soils, building soil carbon. It has a role in the farming system, but the evidence that's coming out is that there is a harvestable amount. So somewhere between 50 and 60% of the biomass, and of course that's going to vary with how well the crop grows because of the weather in the previous year and how much biomass is there, but somewhere between 50 and 60% of that can probably be captured. Then the question becomes, okay, what does that actually look like? And that's what I'm maybe hoping to throw to you, Brad. Like, what's actually involved in the logistics of gathering that material, processing it and getting it to market?
Yeah.
So if we look at it from if we look at it from a residue point of view, if we harvest the residue, bale the residue through a pyrolysis, turn it into a biochar and back, there's another 2 or 3 processes involved in creating or turning two Scope 3 emissions into a benefit for us. So there's a lot that can go wrong in that process. I think I was just in Manitoba and looking at a farm over there, and they were actually capturing, they were creating nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they were using like all renewable energy to do so, and it was quite an intensive operation, but all their nitrogen fertiliser that was required for their own system was generated naturally. And so we can go down that road, and like, so that if we look at the carbon intensity of canola, which is actually quite high, suddenly that can be reduced just by using what's available out there already. And that's, again, that's this technology and investment that's going to help.
Thank you. Any burning questions? One up the back.
Hi, Susie Page from Department of Transport. Just in terms of the final demand, there's going to be a lot of competition from different sectors, aviation, logistics, agriculture, mining, in terms of off-site. Has any forecasting or modelling been done to look at where that demand might go? Thanks.
Brendon, do you want to, or James?
Sorry.
Yeah, so The short answer to that, we haven't done any modelling specifically on that, but what we have done is we've got the transport sector plan that we're working on at the moment, which is based on, I guess, if you asked our net zero unit, I can't remember the exact figure that they worked on, but they looked at about, I think it was over 100 different transport sector plans that have been developed globally, either by governments or by others, to work out what will those pathways be. Now, obviously, low carbon liquid fuels, as I mentioned before, plays a role in some of them, but how much is a bit of an unknown. And it is going to be really hard in the policy development space as well, because, like, just take heavy vehicles, for example. So heavy vehicles, you know, they have a clear pathway that's not low carbon liquid fuels, but it's really difficult. It's really difficult on a number of fronts. You know, batteries are very heavy. It impacts on our road network. You know, hydrogen's still coming online, and exactly how that will play out is sort of yet to be determined. So there's definitely a period of time for heavy vehicles where they can use low carbon liquid fuels before they can transition into those other pathways. So it may be that they take up a bit more to begin with. I don't know. That depends. And it depends on the other thing that we need to think about in the design is we don't necessarily want then heavy vehicles to become reliant on low carbon liquid fuels if they can transition to something that's more efficient and leave that resource for other sectors that are harder to abate, like aviation and like maritime. So it is going to evolve over time. So what we know today and what we can predict today and what we could even model today is actually going to be, I think, vastly different to what we'll think about when we get to 2035, when we think about when we get to 2040. So we'll need to keep rethinking about exactly what the policies are that encourage different uptake. And I think the critical thing, though, is that it's a very long period of time before, you know, low carbon liquid fuels will not be needed at all, if at all. It could be a final solution for decarbonisation for a couple of those sectors.
Another question down the front here.
Yeah, Simon Dawkins from the Oil Mallee Association. One of the things when you talked about mandates and other things, nobody mentioned barriers like CBAMs and other barriers that are actually creating a need for farmers to offset or reduce their emissions in order to get into these markets. CBH is apparently offering a premium for carbon neutral wheat, and I think those sorts of things will also, well, I'm asking your opinion, Brendon, I suppose, will those things also drive this transition?
Yeah, they will. There is a number of broader policies across government that impact on decarbonisation generally that will create demand signals for low carbon liquid fuels besides a specific mandate or of a specific low carbon fuel standard on the sectors that encourages specifically low carbon liquid fuel development and production. You know, the safeguard mechanism is the clear one of that. But I guess the clear thing that we've heard through consultation is that it's just not enough of a demand signal right now. It may be in the future, and when we design our policies, we'll have to be cognizant of that and about that interaction for sure. But there are other things too. The CBAM is another one. There's also the interaction of you know, fuel tax, excise, you know, heavy vehicle charges. There's the national vehicle efficiency standards that have come into play as well. It's a very congested policy space, and it's probably going to continue to be that way for a time. But yeah, they will all impact, and they'll all have their different demand signals that they do signal to the industry. And we'll need to make sure that we can tailor it over time and have it flexible enough so we can accommodate that.
Thanks, Brendon. So we probably have time for one more question before we wrap up.
Has anyone got any idea on what these fuels are going to cost per litre? It's great to see that we can do it, but if it's ridiculously expensive, it's like the idea of what to do.
My favourite question. James, do you want to maybe start with that one?
Yeah, they're expensive.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've looked at, you know, a range of bottom-up modelling for a range of different both production technologies but also feedstocks. What we come out in the modelling is sort of somewhere around the $4 per litre mark. That obviously varies based on a range of conditions, right? So the challenge, and this is maybe to the carbon pricing point, is that from a willingness to pay perspective, the carbon price that you need for the current generation of fuels is really high. So that's why both the demand and supply side policies are helpful, right? Because at an early stage in the market, it's really challenging to reach the scale you need to bring those costs down the curve. Having said that, there are some, really interesting indications from Europe and the US where these markets are functional, right? Where transactions are taking place, where people are finding really clever and interesting ways to make those transactions happen, actually get fuel moving, right? So yes, they're expensive today. I think the other point that's really important to appreciate is you're not just buying the fuel. So comparing on a dollar per litre basis is not the only outcome that matters. You also need to think about the abatement cost of the fuel. And in that context, our expectation is that there'll be premiums attached to fuels that deliver a greater abatement. And, those that maybe don't deliver such a significant abatement won't attract as premium at price, right? So you're not just in a universe of buying the molecule anymore, you're buying the molecule and the abatement.
Thanks, James. So that'll conclude our first session for today. We're breaking for morning tea. Please thank me join me in thanking our panellists this morning, and we'll be back here at 11:15 for the next session.